Good afternoon and welcome again to the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. Well, last week we discussed young Robert Curzon and his visit to the Greek Orthodox monasteries in Meteora, Greece. His time at Meteora was generally disappointing in terms of acquiring ancient Greek manuscripts. Some of the monks had been burned by previous visitors who made them afraid of their motives, and some of the libraries themselves were poorly equipped for his interests, and some of the manuscripts were too late for his interests. So he went away not empty-handed exactly, but much more disappointed than he had hoped. His luck turned, however, when he then went on to the monasteries of Mt Athos, also in Greece. And this is our subject today. Mt Athos and its 20 monasteries, 21 in Curzon's day, was known then as it is now as a haven for ancient manuscripts of the New Testament and other classical literature. The collection at Mt Athos includes a vast array of manuscripts scattered among those many monasteries, some with libraries of 1,000 volumes or more, and some with 500 or even less. But many of those manuscripts that were found date somewhere between the 9th and the 16th centuries. These manuscripts provide crucial insights into the development of the New Testament text, Christian theology, liturgy, and monastic practices in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. John Covell, one of the first English scholars to rummage through the monasteries of the East, wrote that he had seen at Mt Athos, quote, vast heaps of manuscripts of the fathers or other learned men, all covered over with dust and dirt, many of them rotted and spoiled. Curzon was very keen to get his hands on some of these manuscripts. Perhaps his offer of Rosolio would come in handy, as it did in the past. And if not that, then he had hoped his money would do the talking. Now, Mt Athos is a mountain on the Athos Peninsula in northeastern Greece. It is an important center of Eastern Orthodox monasticism. The mountains and most of the Athos Peninsula are governed as an autonomous region in Greece by the monastic community of Mt Athos, which is ecclesiastically under the direct jurisdiction of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. Women are prohibited by Greek law and religious tradition from entering the area governed by the monastic community. Even female animals are prohibited. But monks turn a blind eye to the female cats, since they are of great help to rid the area of mice. You just don't come to Mt Athos uninvited. Typically, you are invited, and only a few exceptions are made to outsiders, those who are not themselves monks. And only, as we said, males may enter. There was a news crew that petitioned for several years without success for access to the mountain and its various monasteries to film a documentary. But finally, after their persistence, it paid off and they were admitted to the monasteries. I'll have a link in the description of this incident. Curzon gained access with a letter from the Archbishop of Canterbury, written to the Patriarch of Constantinople in July of 1837. And the Archbishop requested to the Patriarch to furnish Curzon, quote, with any facilities in his power in his researches among the Greek monasteries which are owned in his sway. Permission was eventually granted, although the Patriarch said he'd never even heard of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So, where is Mt Athos? What is it like? What is its terrain? What is its geography? Well, let's take a quick map tour of the area. So a video and some pictures will follow, giving us an idea of what you see in Mt Athos. The Athos Peninsula protrudes 31 miles into the Aegean Sea. From a width of 4.3 miles to 7.5 miles, and covers an area of 130 square miles. Mt Athos has steep, densely forested slopes reaching up to 6,670 feet. It's also called by the name the Holy Mountain, or Agios Oros in Greek. So let's begin with Curzon's visit to Mt Athos. The first monastery he visited was St. Lawrence, but he did not offer to purchase any manuscripts there as he thought it would not be allowed. And so next he went to the monastery of Caracalla, and he describes his experience in his travel diary that we've discussed before, Visits to the Monasteries in the Levant. And he says this: "The library I found to be a dark closet near the entrance of the church. It had been locked up for many years, but the Agomenos, and again that's the head abbot, made no difficulty in breaking the old-fashioned padlock by which the door was fastened. I found upon the ground and upon some broken down shelves about 400 or 500 volumes, chiefly printed books, but amongst them, every now and then, I stumbled upon a manuscript, and of these there were about 30 on vellum and 50 or 60 on paper. I picked up a single loose leaf of a very ancient, unsealed Greek characters, part of the Gospel of St. Matthew, written in small square letters and of small quarto sized. I searched in vain for the volume to which this leaf belonged. As I had found it impossible to purchase any manuscripts at St. Laura, I feared that the same would be the case in the other monasteries. However, I made bold to ask for this single leaf as a thing of small value. 'Certainly,' said the Agomenos. 'What do you want it for?' My servant suggested that perhaps it might be useful to cover some jam pots or vases of preserves, which I had at home. 'Oh,' said the Agomenos, 'take some more.' And without much ado, he seized upon an unfortunate thick quarto manuscript of the Acts and the Epistles, and drawing out a knife, cut out an inch thickness of leaves at the end before I could stop him. It proved to be the Apocalypse, which concluded the volume, but which is rarely found in early Greek manuscripts of the Acts. It was of the 11th century. I ought perhaps to have slain the Thomicide for his dreadful act of profanation, but his generosity reconciled me to his guilt. So I pocketed the Apocalypse and asked him if he would sell me any of the other books, as he did not appear to set any particular value upon them. 'Malista, certainly,' he replied. 'How many of them will you have? They're of no use to me, and as I am in want of money to complete my buildings, I shall be very glad to turn them to some account.' And so here was his first score at Mt Athos. Next, he made his way to the monastery of Iveron on the peninsula, one of the largest monasteries on Mt Athos. And of its library, he said, 'The library is a remarkably fine one, perhaps altogether the most precious of all those which now remain on the Holy Mountain.' And here he found over 1,000 manuscripts on vellum, among them several illuminated manuscripts of the Gospels and a couple complete New Testaments. 'Unfortunately,' he wrote to us, 'neither my arguments nor eloquence could prevail on the obdurate monks to sell me any of these books.' He then made his way to the monastery of Pantokratoras, and he was told that their library had been destroyed during the recent Greek Revolution. He, being as curious as he was, went to see it nonetheless and describes his feelings in his diary. And I will quote, 'I saw the melancholy remains of once famous library. This was a dismal spectacle for a devout lover of old books, a sort of biblical knight-errant, as I then considered myself, who had entered on the perilous adventure of Mt Athos to rescue from the thraldom of ignorant monks those fair vellum volumes with their bright illuminations and velvet dresses and jeweled clasps, which for so many centuries had lain imprisoned in their dark monastic dungeons. It was indeed a heart-rending sight. By the dim light which streamed through the opening of an iron door in the wall of the ruined tower, I saw 100 ancient manuscripts lying among the rubbish which had fallen from the upper floor, which was ruinous, and had in great part given way. Some of these manuscripts seemed quite entire, fine, large folios, but the monks said they were unapproachable, for that floor also in which they lay was unsafe. Neglect and damp and exposure destroyed them completely. One fine volume, a large folio in double columns of most venerable antiquity, particularly grieved me. I do not know how many more manuscripts there might be under the piles of rubbish. Perhaps some of them might be still legible, but without assistance and time, I could not clean out the ruins that had fallen from above, and as I was unable to save even a scrap from the general tomb of a whole race of books, I came out of the great tower, and sitting down on a pile of ruins with a bearded assembly of grave monks around me, I vented my sorrow and indignation. Yet undeterred, Curzon moved on to the next monastery, the largest and richest on the peninsula, Vatopedi. And here he found 300 or 400 vellum manuscripts, but unfortunately none of which he had particular interest. So he moved to the next monastery, the monastery of Xenophon, where after hours of negotiation, he came away with a copy of the Gospels and 2 other books. And he describes his negotiations this way, quote, "If you offer too much, a Greek, a Jew, or an Armenian immediately thinks the desired object must be invaluable, that it must have some magical properties like the lamp of Aladdin, which will bring wealth upon its possessor if he can but find out its secret. And he'll either ask you a sum absurdly large or will refuse to sell it at any price, but will look upon it and become nervous about it and examine it over and over again privately to see what can be the cause of a franc's offering." In this case, franc usually refers to an Englishman, "for so much of a thing apparently so utterly useless. On the other hand, too little must not be offered, for it would be an indignity to suppose that persons of consideration would condescend to sell things of trifling value." Now, at the monastery of St. Paul, as you can see, he's skipping from one to the next to the next. He was given as a parting gift 3 old copies of the Gospels. And then at the monastery of Semonopetra, he purchased an old copy of the Acts and Epistles. The last monastery he visited before his departure from Mt Athos was the monastery of Caracalla. And he reports that he visited every one of the 21 monasteries on Mt Athos except one, St. Anne, which is not really a monastery, but a collection of hermit cells. And so we end his trip to Mt Athos and the manuscripts that he found there. We will not describe his trip to Jerusalem and the monastery of Marsala near the Dead Sea, where he was allowed to purchase at least 10 important manuscripts. These things he describes in fascinating detail in that travel diary. So let's finish Curzon's story with a brief description of his finds and their significance for New Testament textual studies. The British Library holds the majority of the manuscripts that were collected by Curzon. After his death, his family donated these manuscripts to the British Museum in 1917. The British Museum is now known as the British Library, across from St. Pancras Station in London. Most of the 42 Greek manuscripts from Curzon's collection were of late provenance and have now been digitized as part of the Greek Manuscript Digitization Project. The Bodleian Library, also at the University of Oxford, possesses a variety of Curzon's Greek and Syriac manuscripts. The manuscripts collected by Curzon are of immense scholarly value, providing insights into early Christian texts, the transmission of biblical manuscripts, and the preservation of ancient languages such as Syriac and Palestinian Aramaic. The institutions housing these manuscripts continue to make them available to scholars and researchers for study and analysis, preserving Curzon's legacy as a key feature in the history of New Testament manuscript collection. Keep in mind, he set out on his adventures at the young age of 23, traveling thousands and thousands of miles by boat, by camel, horseback, and on foot, walking through dangerous territory in strange lands. On more than one occasion, he tells us he was in fear for his life, traveling through dangerous roads and from bandits. His methods were suspect at best, but if we believe him, Many of his finds were destined for destruction already at the hands of uninterested and ignorant monks. So he saw himself as rescuing these books for posterity. If for nothing else, he deserves a place in the pantheon of those valiant men and women who we describe as manuscript hunters. So next week, we'll continue this theme of manuscript hunters with a new character to be announced with a YouTube short later this week. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, and share. Links to further research are in the description box below. So we'll see you next week in the next episode, coming to you from the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.